Very much for the invitation. Thank you very much, Julie Lee, especially for organizing this. It's been a terrific experience already, and I'm looking forward to the paper spun by other panelists. This paper is called On Cultural Deference in Aesthetic Judgment. And the paper begins, as you'll see in a moment, with some examples surrounding Chinese painting. But those examples are there to illustrate, I think, a more general problem and a familiar one that arises in a number of different contexts. Whenever one encounters an art form from a different cultural or historical period or both, and one encounters a difference between the way that one is naturally inclined to judge the work as good or bad or beautiful or ugly or harmonious or disharmonious or whatever, and the standards that have been deployed in the work's own home, time, and place. So whenever there's that difference, there's a question of whether we as audience members should defer to those external standards or not. All right, that's as a preliminary. How do I advance slides here? Let me see. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So there's a famous book by Clive Bell, simply called Art. Many of you may be familiar with it. In this book, which was written a little more than 100 years ago, Clive Bell discusses the renowned Eastern Jin Dynasty painter Gu Kaizhi and calls him a primitive artist. But for Clive Bell, that's a compliment, calling someone a primitive artist. For him, primitive art consists only of what he calls significant form. Significant form has universal appeal, according to Bell. All painting, all pictorial art that has value, has what he calls significant form. And primitive art consists only of significant form. And so it has the power to stir up deep and profound aesthetic emotions. Now, throughout the book, Bell actually uses all these examples from art forms. He's a British writer, writing in the late 19th, early 20th century, but he talks about Japanese art, he talks about Chinese art, he talks about African art, and he thinks it is entirely unnecessary for him to know anything about how these works were originally judged or even created. According to Clive Bell, recognition of significant form by itself is sufficient for appreciation. And there's no reason that a sufficiently aesthetically sensitive Englishman, even if he is perfectly ignorant, couldn't ascertain the exact merit of an early Chinese painting. So this is a quote from Clive Bell: "The perfect lover, he who can feel the profound significance of form, is raised above the accidents of time and place. To him, problems of archaeology, history, hagiography are impertinent." Not just unimportant, but impertinent. If the forms of a work are significant, its provenance is irrelevant. Oh, I didn't mean to go to that yet. So according to Bell, then, aesthetic merit is univocal. Every aesthetically good work of art is good for the same reasons. That is, every good work of art is good because it possesses significant form, which in turn gives rise to a distinctive, significant, aesthetic emotion. Consider by contrast how Gu himself, who was not just a painter, but also a critic of painting, how he advised viewers to judge the paintings that he made and the paintings with which he was familiar. So this is a quote from Gu, from Paul Golden's translation. "If one depicts the spirit by means of shapes and disregards the essence of the original, the function of capturing life will go awry, and the objective of transmitting the spirit will fail." There's a lot going on in this quote, more than I'm going to attempt to unpack right now. But there's little doubt here that Gu is invoking a general norm that is often invoked in discussions of Chinese painting, that the painter should aim to depict the essence of the subject and not merely the subject's visual appearance. So another well-known story involving Gu has him adding facial hair to a subject, even though the subject didn't in life possess those facial hairs, in order to demonstrate features of that person's inner character. So here's a quote again from Golden. When he, Gu, painted Pei Kai's likeness, he added three hairs to his jaw, saying, Kai was high-minded and splendid and possessed understanding. These hairs are precisely that understanding. When viewers looked carefully, they surely felt the rare excellence of this insight. So in other words, this norm, which was widely accepted in early Chinese painting, was that in judging a painting, one should attend closely to how successfully the painter had conveyed the essence of the subject, rather than the subject's visual appearance. Another widely accepted norm for judging early Chinese paintings is to do with stroke strength and ease. Critics of Chinese paintings often spent a great deal of time discussing the strength of the brush strokes and the order of the strokes and how each stroke led to the subsequent stroke. Gao Jiangping summarizes it this way. Whenever a Chinese critic praised a painting, he always wrote about the way a painter used the brush. Paintings were constantly described as bijing mo miao. Excuse my terrible pronunciation. The brush is succinct and the ink is wonderful. Part of the critic's job was to note the strength and the flow of each stroke of paint or ink on the canvas in order to judge the excellence of the painter's performance in creating the work. The skill and virtue of the artist, and I believe this is something you're going to talk about later with respect to calligraphy, was evident in the brushwork. We're able to tell something about the person who created it. There's a lot more to say here, and I suspect my co-panelists will have more to say, but I just want to focus on these two norms, and there are many more that one could list, which I think are widely accepted. First, a painting should convey the essence of its subject, not its likeness. And second, a painting should show strong and easy brushwork, making the order of strokes clear and natural. Now, these norms developed in the history and context of Chinese painting. These norms are not common norms, or for example, in European painting, in the judgment and critical discussion of them. They developed over hundreds of years, roots in pre-Han writings, with later painting critics responding to and modifying views of earlier critics. And what I'm saying is, there's a lot of complexity here that I'm looking over. There are different ways of interpreting these norms. These norms evolve over time, but something like these two general principles were pretty familiar for many hundreds of years. So the question is, do these two norms tell us the right way to judge early Chinese painting? The intuitive idea is that it would be appropriate for works that have been created in a culture whose norms were widely understood and accepted by the artists who created them to be judged according to those norms, whereas it would not be appropriate to apply those norms to paintings from India or Europe or any other tradition where those norms are not widely known or accepted. In other words, should we be historically and culturally relative in our application of aesthetic norms to art? The idea would be every work of art should be judged, at least partly, that is, these norms are not complete. These are some of the norms that you would use in judging the work, not all. At least partly, you would have these norms to judge the work. So I think we have now in front of us two contrasting methods. First, I'm going to call universalism, and this is the Clive Bell approach. Universalism says that the aesthetic merit of a work of art is determined by universal norms that are entirely independent of the work's cultural and historical context. Beauty is beauty. Significant form is significant form. It does not matter what culture it comes from. It does not matter what era It comes from, if something is beautiful, it should have universal appeal. The aesthetic merit of all works of art should be judged, at least partly, by these same norms. Oh, sorry. The second approach, which we've just sketched, would give deference to local norms. It's not one that's been much discussed by philosophers, anyway, although art historians and cultural anthropologists have often endorsed some version of it. For example, the art historian E.H. Gombrich, in discussing the Mustard Seed Garden Manual of Painting, a Qing Dynasty text, comments that the instructions offered in the manual are appropriate for this specific tradition of Chinese painting, whereas a different set of instructions would be appropriate, for example, in Egyptian art. He writes, "It's clear even to the non-specialist, the Chinese method must have been admirably adapted to the function of art in this beautifully consistent culture, as the formulas derived by Egyptian art were adapted to their purpose." In cultural anthropology, Richard Anderson has done a wonderful comparative study of different systems of aesthetics, and he claims that different cultures not only have different art practices, but also different practices for evaluating art, different practices for rating certain artworks as good or bad, and that each system of evaluation is well suited to the art form in question. So these comments express support for the general idea of applying norms to art that were generally accepted at the place and time of their creation. Let me state this principle a little more explicitly. Now we have two opposing principles here. We have universalism, and we also have cultural deference. Cultural deference says that the aesthetic merit of a work of art is determined at least partly by the aesthetic norms dominant in the cultural and historical context in which the work was produced. The aesthetic merit of all works of art should be judged at least partly by the norms that are internal to the context of origin. Okay. Actually, let me make one quick note. This, at least partly, is important. We are not, the culturally deferent person does not have to deny that there could be certain features of, for example, early Chinese paintings that are of universal appeal. It's just that to have a complete appreciation and complete evaluation of the work, one needs also to attend to those culturally specific elements and norms. Okay, the rest of the paper is going to have three main parts. First, I'm going to look at three arguments in favor of cultural deference, which I'll call the modesty argument, the purposes argument, and the justice argument. Of these three, I will argue that only the justice argument is successful. The modesty and purposes arguments do not, to my mind, give us compelling reason to adopt cultural deference. However, the justice argument does give us a very strong reason to adopt cultural deference. I will then look at an argument against cultural deference based on the value of autonomy, and I will defend this argument against some objections. Then finally, in my brief conclusion, I will discuss some ways that we might resolve the conflict between the justice argument in favor of cultural deference and the autonomy argument against it, and how we might find a way forward through an account I call contextualism. Okay, so let's turn to modesty. The modesty argument begins with a widely accepted claim that aesthetic properties are themselves context dependent. That is, what properties the work has depends on what type of work it is. Since you can only make judgments of aesthetic merit if you first have a proper understanding of what the aesthetic properties are, one must use context-appropriate norms in making aesthetic judgments. Lack of appropriate historical or cultural knowledge of a work's properties would preclude forming a full and correct judgment of the work's aesthetic value. So here's a more formal statement of the argument. I won't read it aloud, it's here on the slide. I think the first premise is about as uncontroversial as any claim in aesthetics can be, which is not to say it's entirely uncontroversial, right? But I think it's a fairly familiar one, that you can't make an accurate judgment of a work unless you understand its aesthetic properties. So I'm going to pass by that one. The second premise needs a little bit of defense and explanation, but I ultimately think it is plausible. The third premise, I think, is where we're going to get into trouble. And I'll get to that in a minute. Let's talk a little bit about premise one first. It might be sufficient to note that no value judgment of the strength or ease of a brushstroke, for example, can be made without knowing how strong or easy the brushstroke actually is. Now, Clive Bell would probably reject this premise on the grounds that significant form would just cause the appropriate aesthetic emotion in any sensitive observer, and that's all you need to make an aesthetic judgment. But most contemporary philosophers of art reject this view, in part because of the great influence of Kendall Walton's paper, Categories of Art, that many of you may be familiar with. In this famous paper, Walton argues that an artwork's aesthetic properties depend in part on the work's historical context, because historical context tells us what type of work it is that we're dealing with. Whether a work, for example, is an early Chinese painting fixes which of its properties are relevant to evaluating it aesthetically. So I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly, and if there are questions, we can come back to it. But the basic idea in Walton is that the properties of artworks are of three basic kinds. Standard properties are properties that do not ordinarily vary within a category. So for paintings, we're talking about Chinese paintings, European paintings, paintings of any kind, they are relatively two-dimensional and they're static. That is, they contain no moving parts. Those are standard features of paintings. There are, as we'll get to in a minute, some exceptions, but that is the norm and the expectation. So the fact that a painting is static is not something that a critic would normally comment on, because it's not worth noting. Not normally relevant, then, standard properties to aesthetic judgment. Variable properties are the properties that we mostly attend to. They're what make one painting of a particular kind different from the next painting of a particular kind. So, for example, the representational subject, the color, the line, the size, right? All of these things can vary, and the shape. All of these things can vary, and these are the kinds of properties that normally ground aesthetic properties and thus aesthetic judgment. Finally, there are contrastandard properties. So contrastandard properties are properties of works that violate the standard expectations. So if you've seen some Gerhard Richter paintings, for example, they often have three-dimensional elements protruding from them, right, which is a contrastandard feature. And yet they're still treated as paintings. One odd thing about contrastandard paintings is, or contrastandard properties, is that if a work possesses too many contrastandard properties, at a certain point it stops being, right, or at least it questionably loses its membership in that category. John Cage's famous composition, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, right, which of course has no intentional sound, it's just a series of rests in 3 movements, pushes the boundaries of what can count as music in the first place. Now, why are we talking about all of this? Well, one might think that, so I'm skipping around here, give me a moment. All right, so one might object that many works which are not early Chinese paintings have the same properties as early Chinese paintings. So Picasso's portraits have often been praised for the way they convey the essence of their subjects. This is the famous painting that he did of Gertrude Stein, where according to the story anyway, he showed the portrait to Gertrude Stein and she said, "That doesn't look anything like me." And he said, "It will." And the idea being somehow that it conveyed what people think of Stein rather than what she actually looked like. Similarly, Cézanne and much of post-impressionist French painting is often praised for its careful and strong brushwork and making that brushwork highly visible in the post-impressionist era and impressionist paintings as well. So then you might say, well, doesn't that just show that there is no distinct category of early Chinese painting? But I think this problem can be addressed by individuating aesthetic properties more finely. Well, many European portraits do attempt at least to convey the essence of the subject. The specific notion of transmitting the spirit in the original quote from Gu is a little bit different. This phrase was likely a reference to the Zhuangzi, with the attendant ideas there about the importance of forgetting the self and the limits of human categorization of the world around us. So I think it's plausible to say that the aesthetic properties of a work of early Chinese painting are not the same and are not universal. You need some knowledge of specific features like capturing life. So I'm going to just accept premise 2 and move on to premise 3. Here, we need a reason to think that in order to understand the context, one must also adopt the norms that are dominant. In other words, yes, it's true you need to know what strong brushwork is, but do you need to think that strength in brushwork is good? Or could you say, I agree that brushwork is weak according to traditional standards, but I like the weakness in it. I think the weakness in it is a good thing. It's not clear that there's any argument for that here. I'm going to skip over, because this paper spends probably too much time on Walton. I'm going to skip over a little bit more on Walton here and move on to the next point. So you said we have 20 to 40 minutes. Is that right, Edith? Yeah, okay. I want to keep it under 40 minutes, so I'll skip over this section. All right, let's talk next about purposes. Another reason you might think that we should adopt cultural deference is because works of art share certain purposes, and those purposes are culturally and historically specific. Now, the relevance of the artist's intention to judging the meaning and merit of a work is highly contentious, certainly ever since the famous paper by Wimsatt and Beardsley, The Intentional Fallacy. But that's not what I'm talking about. We don't need to talk about the intentions of individual artists in order to argue that the aesthetic merit of an artwork can depend on culturally and historically specific norms. Instead, we can invoke the notion of a collectively understood purpose behind an art practice. It seems to matter, for example, that virtually every person who would have viewed Gu's paintings in his own lifetime would have expected to see the spirit of the persons in the painting captured in his work. Presumably, Gu himself also intended that, but that's not what matters. Catherine Abel has made this argument with respect to genre. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what she says about genre and then try to adopt that here. She argues that different genres of art each have distinct purposes, and each genre's purpose is determined by the common expectation of both the artists and the audiences. Oh, that's the wrong slide. Oh, so there we go. Okay. So she says, a genre is a category of works determined by the purpose for which they are produced and appreciated, where the means by which they pursue that purpose rely at least partly on producers and audiences' common knowledge that the works are produced and to be appreciated for that purpose. She further argues these purposes ground a norm for judging the work's success. To say what genre work belongs to is to indicate a purpose that it should serve, and thus to suggest that it should employ whatever means available would best enable it to serve that purpose. Once you know what the purpose is of the work, you know how to judge it as good or bad. And since purposes are genre specific and genres are cultural and historically specific, we then have an argument for cultural deference. Let's then look at two claims she's making here. First, each culturally and historically distinct argument form has its own set of purposes. Is that true? And second, that these purposes actually ground norms that fail to achieve their culturally, what did I do to make balloons? Culturally and historically appropriate purposes fail aesthetically. The first claim says each art form has its own set of purposes. This seems like a fact that Clive Bell overlooked. According to Bell, all art has just one purpose, the production of aesthetic emotion. However, the idea that there is only one thing at which all art aims seems dubious, and Clive Bell's views about aesthetic emotion and significant form have few adherents today. It is far more plausible, I think, that purposes in art are tied, at least partly, to the cultural and historical circumstances of their creation. So I think the first claim looks very reasonable. But the second claim is more difficult to justify. Why are we obligated as observers to judge works according to whether or not they achieve their aim? Sometimes works fail at their aim, but they succeed in other ways. And why can we not appreciate those in other ways? So there is a film that is infamous in the US. It's about a 20-year-old movie. It's become a cult film called The Room. It was an independently produced film by Tommy Wiseau. The genre is melodrama. It is utterly incompetent in every way that a film can be incompetent. It is just terrible and it's become famous for being terrible. Many people consider it to be the worst film ever made. But as a comedy, it is very, very funny. And it is very popular. People go to see this movie to laugh. And Tommy Wiseau himself, the director, appreciates this. So you reject the purpose for which the work was made, but you impose some other purpose on it, and then suddenly as a comedy, it's for work. What would stop me then from doing the same thing with a painting by Gu Kaji? Oh, there's some sound coming in from the audience now.
Can I mute? How can I mute them? Okay. Did I mute them successfully?
I think they made the balloons or
Yeah, I think it's from the audience. Yeah, I think I muted them.
Okay.
I don't really know who this person is. Okay.
Thank you very much, Hilda. Appreciate it. Now, the question then is, could I do the same thing, right? As a Westerner, if I were to look at a painting by Gu Kaiju, this is a copy. I think actually all we have are copies. Is that right? Of Gu's paintings. If I were to look at Nymph of the Low River and look at it as though it were a romantic landscape, right? And use the norms of romantic landscape paintings in order to judge, would I be doing something wrong if I treated it like a Constable painting? I think there is something troubling in this case that isn't troubling in the case of the Room movie, right? Having to do with a lack of respect for the tradition of Chinese paintings. But I don't think that the preceding argument gets at those reasons. I think the reasons have to do with justice, and that's what I want to talk about next. The idea that some aesthetic judgments can be unjust is not a new one, but it's been getting a lot more attention in recent years. Some conceptions of aesthetic injustice focus on the harm done to natural environments by finding certain things beautiful and other things ugly. So on the slide, you'll see purple loosestrife on the left. Purple loosestrife is an invasive species that has disrupted wetlands of North America, driving out native species. I think it's very beautiful, right? But there's an idea that we should not see it as beautiful, because seeing it as beautiful has allowed it to spread, right, and disrupt native ecosystems. Other conceptions of aesthetic injustice have had to do with unfair ways in which artists belonging to certain communities have been judged, or how certain conceptions of beauty unjustly disadvantage women, people of color, members of other oppressed groups. So you have here on the right an image from Adrian Piper's art, which is, oh, sorry, I've forgotten the title, but the aim of the art is again to expose the prejudice that people have and the fear that people have of Black men. The kind of injustice that I want to talk about is different than these types of injustice. The claim here is that it's unjust to make an aesthetic judgment using a set of aesthetic standards from outside the work's home tradition. That we've got something akin to cultural appropriation here, not exactly the same as cultural appropriation, but in the same family. Benze Nene, I think, gives the most clear articulation of this. In his view, and he's, by the way, developing a view that was first set out by Loretta Todd, it's unjust to take up what he calls the expert attitude with respect to works of art outside one's own cultural home. So he says here on the slide, the expert attitude is the attitude of someone feeling more of an expert in someone else's experience than that person is. So when Clive Bell disregards the views of a Chinese counterpart who tells him, oh, you need to pay attention to the strength of the brushstrokes, Bell says, who cares? Significant form, it's universal, I'm not interested. He is treating someone else with disrespect. And to treat someone else with disrespect is wrong, and that is why we should engage in cultural deference. It's important to note that Bell and his Chinese counterpart are not epistemic peers here. Bell's Chinese counterpart knows more than Bell does, simply by virtue of familiarity with the practices of Chinese paintings and the norms and practices around them. This is true even if Bell's counterpart is not an expert, right? Even when Bell's knowledge about the painting itself and its properties are roughly equal, the Chinese counterpart has an epistemic advantage, and Bell should defer to her way of judging it. The idea is that because cultural outsiders are not epistemic peers of cultural insiders, there is a duty of cultural deference that outsiders are required to take up when it comes to rendering aesthetic judgments. And by the way, Nene is interested in further problems that arise from this, because if you are prevented from making your own aesthetic judgments, then the kind of aesthetic judgments that you can make as an outsider, according to Nene, are limited. You can't make the same kinds of judgments that you could make with respect to works that are internal to your own cultural experience. The expert attitude is unjust because it fails to respect the insiders who have the relevant sorts of background to appreciate the work in the right way, that is, in the way fixed by its cultural purposes. The injustice is a failure to accord appropriate respect to others. I think this is important. The injustice isn't done to the painting, right? Paintings are inanimate objects. They aren't the victims of injustice. The injustice is done to other appreciators, other people whose expertise and experience is not being respected. Okay, I think we now have a compelling reason to engage in cultural deference. However, we're not done, because unfortunately, I think there is also a compelling reason not to engage in cultural deference. While the justice argument is compelling, I think we also need to think about aesthetic autonomy. Aesthetic autonomy is the value that is realized by having the freedom to value aesthetically according to one's own values and priorities, including valuing something in order to realize or express something in ourselves. Autonomy is what Nick Riggle has called discretionary valuing. It's the phenomenon of being able to value an aesthetic object being guided by our own set of norms and priorities. I want to briefly make the case that autonomy is an important part of our evaluative and motivational lives, and that autonomy is really important to the practice of aesthetic evaluation. I'm going to give 3 reasons. First, autonomy promotes individual growth and exploration. Secondly, autonomy helps to form and strengthen communities. And thirdly, autonomy teaches us to learn to practice disagreement safely. Okay, first reason, promoting individual growth. The art we engage with, the art we really engage with in a serious way, changes who we are. If you grow up with some forms of art and not others, you will become a different person. So if you like low-budget horror movies, Terrifier, or masterpiece theaters, traditional British, very stately classics, which one of those you grow up listening to, watching, right? I mean, will change you as a person. If you become the kind of person who likes both of those, that will make you a different person still. And if you become the kind of person who likes those plus classical Chinese painting, that will also change you as a person. We ought to have the freedom to help shape our own aesthetic characters. Each of us has distinctive aesthetic interests, aesthetic tendencies, aesthetic tastes, certain things that we are drawn to, that we become passionate about. And one of the wonderful things about life is the ability to choose a path and to say, I want to grow in this direction. Autonomy gives us that. Cultural deference tends to limit what we can do there by forcing us to stay in our cultural home. So that's the first reason. The second really comes from Nick Riggle's work on the relationship between art and community. When we engage with work, we engage often with others who enjoy that work. So this is a photograph of Bloomsday, which just happened the other day. Okay, so Bloomsday is a celebration in Ireland of James Joyce's work, and particularly Ulysses. So on Bloomsday, they walk the path in Dublin that the protagonist walks in the novel Ulysses. They dress like the character. And everyone here seems very happy, except that little boy in front, who looks very unhappy to be there. But the rest of them, you see, they're celebrating together. And the point is that the art we choose to engage with draws us in connection with other people who also love that art. And so it's good for us, again, to have autonomy here so that we can form and build communities of our choosing. And communities not only build around sets of objects, but also around particular ways of appreciating objects. So we can build communities as appreciators who might want to appreciate works of art in non-standard, non-normative ways. Now, do we need these aesthetic communities? No. You can live without them. You can be solitary appreciator of a work of art, but it is a good making feature to have these, and many, many people derive great value from. The third reason is autonomy makes it easier to engage in certain kinds of interpersonal disagreement. When we disagree about art, it's often the case that the stakes are actually wonderfully low. Our passions may be high, but nothing terrible will happen as a result, as opposed to, say, disagreements about religion, disagreements about political territory, disagreements about money, disagreements about many, many things in life lead to violence, lead to war, lead to terribly important things. Disagreements about aesthetic judgments almost never do. If I insist on judging Rose Nymph of the Low River by looking at it as a landscape painting in the Romantic tradition, you might think I'm crazy, but you're not going to beat me up, probably, right? And I won't clearly have done any harm. And it is good for us to disagree with one another in ways that are productive and not harmful. Aesthetics can teach us how to do that in a way that morality cannot. All right, now let me consider a couple of objections. One objection to the value of autonomy in aesthetics is that you can't really unlock the aesthetic value of certain kinds of art unless one accepts the norms that standardly govern that sort of work. So for example, Guy Rohrbach, and I think Joe, I think you think this too, think that we have an obligation to comply with the score in Western classical music, that we have to play all the notes. Right? You have different reasons for thinking of it than Rohrbach does, but you agree on the general point. Is that right? Yeah. So the idea is that if you don't adhere to the score, then certain aesthetic values would not be realized if you don't follow these norms. So specifically, score compliance enables a degree of complexity and repeatability that allows us to compare one performance to another and allows for appreciation of different interpretations of the same musical piece. If we didn't have score compliance, we wouldn't be able to have those experiences and we wouldn't be able to have those values. I'm inclined to agree that we wouldn't have those things. But on the other hand, right, if you accept, I don't think that gives us a reason to abandon autonomy, because sometimes we abandon standard ways of appreciating and some values disappear, but other values arise. When we appreciate works in non-standard ways, we might find a new idiosyncratic type of beauty and insight. And I'll just mention an example here. There's a philosopher at Oberlin Conservatory who talks about traditional Black audience appreciation of musical work and the element of call and response and audience participation, where the audience will join in on the musical work or respond loudly in various ways. Now, this is against the norms of Western classical music listening. You're supposed to be silent until the end of the piece. You're not supposed to speak back or burst into applause in the middle of the piece. But he argues that acting in these contra-standard ways can actually enrich your aesthetic experience of the work in a distinct way, having to do with the African-American aesthetic. Another objection comes from what Samantha Mathern calls aesthetic exploration. Mathern says, and I agree, that aesthetic exploration is a good thing. It's an activity in which we engage with items of aesthetic value that are unfamiliar to us, given our personal and local horizons. Aesthetic exploration is good because it encourages us to challenge ourselves. She offers the example of the Irish novelist John Banville, pictured here. Banville was apparently asked how his tastes in poetry had changed over his life. And he responded that his tastes had not changed, and that this was a terrible thing and a source of some regret. And he wished he had challenged himself to enjoy and appreciate new forms of poetry. So Mathern worries that without aesthetic exploration, we'll be left with a very limited variety of aesthetic experiences. Sorry, lost my place here. Mathern's focus is on limiting the variety of different objects that we might appreciate, but we might also worry that autonomy could interfere with aesthetic exploration as well, by limiting our exploration of different norms by which we might judge and assess the art we engage with. So I'm a Westerner, I'm not going to engage with Chinese painting because I need to culturally defer, so that would then limit myself as an aesthetic exploration. So the potential problem with autonomy is the person who engages with a wide range of artworks, but judges them only by a rather narrow set of norms, will have just as limited aesthetic experiences as Clive Bell might have. I think we can answer this objection by drawing a distinction between the value of an agent's autonomy and being empowered to choose their own norms, and the value of an agent's making certain choices rather than others. It's consistent with holding that it is best for agents to have the power to make a certain set of choices for themselves, even while acknowledging that some of these choices are genuinely better than others. So in other words, I could say, I understand that in some sense, the judgment that I am making is wrong or contra-standard. Nonetheless, that judgment for me is the product of my choice, and it'll unlock a value that I find to be distinctively important. While aesthetic exploration is certainly good, there are a great many ways of exploring, and having the freedom to choose how to engage in aesthetic exploration is both good and compatible with the agents engaging with a wide variety of objects and a wide variety of norms for assessment. So I don't think there's any reason to reject aesthetic autonomy in order to promote the good of aesthetic exploration. Okay, now we'll get to the final section. How do we balance then? We have now a moral reason involving justice that tells us to engage in cultural deference, and an aesthetic reason, autonomy, not to. What do we do? I think I'm going to briefly canvass 4 ways of answering or resolving this problem, and then I will offer a tentative endorsement of one of them. But I will say I think this is a difficult matter, and it's not clear to me what is in fact the right way of resolving this conflict and what approach one should take. So I'll be very interested in what the rest of you think. The first is the moralizing approach. This says that moral reasons are simply more important. Justice is the more important consideration. That's what we should do. The second is inaptness. And this says that moral reasons simply don't apply to aesthetic norms. Don't worry, I'm just going through this quickly. I'll slow down a minute and go through each one by one. Moral reasons don't apply to aesthetic norms. We shouldn't be thinking about morality at all when we engage with art. The third is to draw a distinction between public and private. So in public contexts, we engage in cultural deference, but when you're alone by yourself, you can feel free, right, to disregard it. And finally, contextualism, which would say that whenever a particular act of deference, oh, I've got this backwards. If refusing to defer would cause harm, right, then we should defer. Otherwise, we can feel free not to. Moralizing. On this view, whatever good might be secured through aesthetic autonomy by judging Chinese painting by outsider norms will always be outweighed by concerns about justice. Justice is more important than beauty. It just overrides, right? This is sometimes called the overridingness thesis in philosophy. It says that moral reasons always take precedence over non-moral reasons, whether those reasons are prudential, aesthetic, or something else. Many philosophers, however, have opposed the overridingness thesis for a number of reasons, but the best known is Susan Wolf's famous claim that the world would be a less good and less interesting place if moral reasons always overrode aesthetic reasons. So for this reason, I don't favor the moralizing approach. The inaptness approach goes in the other direction. This denies the applicability of moral reasons to the adoption of aesthetic norms. This is a relative of a view sometimes famously advocated by Oscar Wilde, pictured here, that the realm of the aesthetic is on its own and distinct from the realm of morality. Clive Bell also advocates a version of this view. Art is simply not amenable to moral evaluation, period. It might be a natural extension of this view to deny the amenability of moral reasons to the question of which norms we should use to judge art's aesthetic worth. The radical autonomists, like Oscar Wilde, at least possibly, it's hard to know what Oscar Wilde really thought, but according to a famous quote, you would deny the relevance of moral considerations to aesthetic judgment. There might be good moral reasons to use non-moral norms, like the norm praising easy and strong brushstrokes. An advocate of inaptness might say that when it comes to thinking about how we make aesthetic judgments, moral reasons have no place whatsoever. Either moral reasons are completely swamped by the aesthetic reasons, or there are no moral reasons for or against adopting norms of aesthetic judgment at all. In either case, the inaptness view amounts to a denial of the argument for justice. Now, I think the difficulty with this position is that its implications are rather extreme. It seems clear that at least in some cases, praising and condemning works of art have important consequences for the artist and for others connected to the artist. If I were in a position of power in the art world, then my negative aesthetic judgments could make it hard for an artist to make a living or for others to experience their work, and it seems such consequences are morally salient. Regardless of whether such moral constraints win the day, it seems clear that they matter and they can't be simply disregarded as entirely irrelevant. For this reason, I don't think we should take inaptness too seriously. The next is to make a distinction between public and private. On this view, we would acknowledge that the expert attitude gives us a reason to adopt local norms, but only with respect to public aesthetic judgments. After all, it's only when one's aesthetic judgments are made public that they can bring about the morally salient consequences outlined above. So only public judgments are governed by moral reasons. When it comes to making private aesthetic judgments, let autonomy reign. A private aesthetic judgment cannot have any morally significant effect on anyone, and so such judgments need not be governed by cultural difference. I think this one is a little bit better, but it does face some difficulties. First, some philosophers would argue that even a private judgment could be morally salient insofar as it affects our inner character, right? The way we're judging the work changes who we are, and that might matter. Second, truly private aesthetic judgments, like literally private, shared with no one, are actually extremely rare. And so this would mean that the sphere of autonomy is very, very small. Third, not all public aesthetic judgments seem to be morally salient. If I have no power in a particular aesthetic world, then the fact that I make an idiosyncratic aesthetic judgments of a work is unlikely to bring out any real consequences for anyone or cause any kind of injustice. So this approach might be too constraining. The final approach is a rather unsatisfying approach, but I think it might be the correct one. I didn't know what to do for an image here. This is contextualist architecture that fits that's designed to fit its environment. A contextualist approach would encourage us to ask, would refusing to adopt the local norms for judging this work in this case cause someone offense or harm? Would it invoke the expert attitude, as Nene says, in a way that would offend, that would harm, or cause injustice in a particular case? If the moral risk is low and the aesthetic reward is high, then we need not defer. Otherwise, we should defer. Exactly how and to whom we express our aesthetic experience differs greatly from context to context. But it is fair to say the more power one has socially and in the art world, the stronger the reasons there are for deference. The less powerful one is, the less strong those reasons are likely to be. What kinds of aesthetic communities a person belongs to and what role one has in those communities are going to matter a great deal. There's a great amount to be gained by learning about a set of aesthetic norms to which one is an outsider. Understanding how early Chinese painting critics thought about stroke strength and order and ease can lead one to see new things in these paintings and to appreciate features one might otherwise miss. But whether these local norms are ones we should always adhere to is not, I think, a settled question. There should also be a space for idiosyncratic and even outsider approaches to engaging with and judging art. In refusing to commit completely to cultural deference, we need not then retreat to Clive Bell's simplistic universalism. We can use discretion to decide when and where cultural deference is appropriate. Thank you. Not sure.
We have to.
Yes, you keep.
Oh, right, keep it for Q&A.
Questions? I guess we don't have any questions online, right? Let me see. Okay, I guess we can stop sharing the screen. Okay, let me see. Do we have any question online? Nope. Do we have any question from the audience?
This is so interesting. Also, the issue encounters all the time when we go to the museum, especially For
Yes.
example. So the reader, the audience from one culture, and we go to a foreign country and go to the museum, go to the gallery, we immediately ask questions like, we see anything sensible, we see anything meaningful about this work of art. We actually say, well, if you do not have any knowledge about this culture or this country, how would you see any meaningful about this culture? So I think the issue, the topic will be, it's all of us. We encounter this problem, we encounter this issue. I think we actually seriously consider it from a philosophical and aesthetic perspective. And I think it has wide implications. For example, for a teacher, education, instead of asking, well, is self-statement that is beautiful, the teacher would say, what context beauty in the specific culture for its creators. I'm not asking a question, I'm just saying something. The writer is from my mind after listening to your presentation. And whether there are universal criteria for judging artistic excellence, also for literary scholars, right? Think about the subject of comparative literature. Literature, I think the intention of the creation of the subject, that is, we will need to analyze, we need to understand and appreciate the literary works from the last tradition. How to say this? We need to respect the tradition, the literary tradition. We should not understand poem, for example, haiku in Japanese tradition from a Western perspective, or vice versa. And I think the paper also does not conclude that we must always defer to original culture and make it provide space for aesthetic autonomy. The argument viewer should also be free to develop the resources. For example, you mentioned Kukai's Chinese painting, skill painting. Your Western viewer might say, well, this is about environmental protection. Yes, environmental concerns, but it's not the purpose of it's not the intent of the original Chinese painter. But can we say this is wrong? No, we can't. You simply can't, right? So in this sense, aesthetic autonomy, you cannot say it's correct or wrong, but it's healthy, I think. It's very healthy. It makes sense. And also, well, perhaps like growth. And also it has implications beyond the aesthetic meanings, well, this of the Chinese landscape tradition. I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay, and also, I think this issue is also related to the intercultural dynamic. Basically, it could go beyond the aesthetic discussion and try and encourage us to think about the nature of the cultural dynamic. How can we balance respect for another culture without judgment? Yeah, that's my reflection for listening to your report. Yeah, I think it's a wide implications for politics.
So, thank you. I just want to add one thing quickly. I think the encounter can happen in a couple of different ways. So we're going to go see Chinese opera tomorrow night. Tomorrow night? Tonight? Tomorrow. Yeah. And I don't know anything about Chinese opera. I've never seen Chinese opera. I'm very excited. Okay. I'm very excited. So this will be a good example of complete ignorance on my part, right? And I don't know what I will like, what I will enjoy, but I know that I don't know anything about how it's really to be understood, traditionally appreciated. I'll learn a little bit.
I look forward to hearing your comments and your judgment of this
But-
art.
But I also think that the problem or the phenomenon arises again later. So when you first learn about a new cultural tradition, there's this moment where you don't know anything and it just strikes you kind of just on a raw sensory level. You either find it beautiful or overwhelming or disturbing or strange, and you're just processing. And if you don't even understand the language, right, there's so much you're missing, but you still get kind of a raw sensory experience. But then if you stick with it, but you're still an outsider, you start to learn a little bit more. You mentioned Japanese poetry, right? Yes. So you can start to learn a little bit more about it and still be an outsider and say, okay, no, I'm starting to understand some of the traditions, some of the symbolism, some of the standard metaphors, and you can start to learn a little bit more. And then, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I have too. You can still find that you're saying, okay, I think I understand it. I think this poem is beautiful. And someone is saying, well, that's kind of a lesser poem. This is really, and I say, I don't see it. I don't understand. Someone will tell me, this is the best, piece of music. And I say, I like this one better. So even when you're learning, you can still experience this dissonance where the insider will tell you, no, this is the beautiful one. As an outsider, you say, I don't know, I prefer this, or I don't like that. And you wonder, is that just something idiosyncratic about me, or is it still a matter of ignorance, something that I haven't learned yet? And right, yeah. But my point is that even when you're not completely ignorant, even when you're learning, I think this phenomenon can still occur, where you say, I have a different judgment than the judgment of the experts who are insiders. And should I defer to theirs?
Yeah.
Or should I just enjoy my own?
Yeah.
Somewhat idiosyncratic and perhaps incorrect, at least by traditional standards, but it's just something I like.
Okay. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I guess that's like a following up question. Continuing where you have just said with Sean's comments. So you mentioned that when the dissonance appears, when you are in this process of making a different kind of art outside of your own culture, the question appears as, should I stay with my original preference, or should I defer to the cultural experts' testimony, basically? Yeah, I take that to be the main motivation, and I get your answer is more like, yeah, you kind of should defer to the experts' testimony.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and while I was listening to your presentation, one question occurs to me, like, when we have to approach to untangle this question, one approach is to take it as a kind of moral encroachment in aesthetics. Another approach is to just take this question within the aesthetic realm. And sometimes I feel like you want to take the first approach, but sometimes I feel like you are probably more inclined to take it within the second approach as well. So I'm not really quite sure which approach you are taking at this moment. Personally, I kind of like a purity person. I hate all kinds of moral equation, even though I do think moral reasons in a lot of ways overriding our other reasons, overriding our abstract reasons, overriding our aesthetic reasons. But I think if I think moral equation, not because I think moral reasons are not important, but because I think we could actually find a way to justify aesthetic difference within that aesthetic area, because I think there might be a way to see that the reason we defer to the experts, not only because we want to show our respect to people within that culture, that is a moral reason, but we also want to grant them the kind of academic expertise they have for their for the artwork in their own culture. So what I'm trying to say is that we want to see that if I think it could be argued that artworks have some objective aesthetic properties, aesthetic merits associated based on the aesthetic properties, and these properties can be more easy to be accessed if you are coming from that culture, or if you are familiar with that culture, like you teach yourself a lot on that culture. Like compared to some of my friends who have been like studying Chinese philosophy, Chinese aesthetics for like decades, I take myself as this expertise, even though I'm a Chinese, I grew up in China. I'm supposed to be familiar with Chinese arts, but I can still see for people who have that expertise, I think I can defer to their judgment, not because I want to show show the respect to them, but because I take them to have more epistemic access for Chinese art. So if we're on that route, so probably we still want to say something like, it's not doing justice to the artwork, but it's more like doing it in an appropriate way for the artwork, for appreciating that artwork. So yeah. So how can I summarize my question? Yeah, my first question is just about how you think about different approaches to tackle that question, your motivational question. The second question is about how you think about the relationship between experts, like the cultural experts and the aesthetic properties of that artwork. Is that because they have like epistemic access to these experts or to this artwork, or somehow this that aesthetic merit of this artwork somehow can be traced back to the people within that culture? So thank you.
Thanks. There's a lot there. So let me begin by making a distinction. And maybe you would not accept this distinction, but I will try. So and by the way, I agree that even another member of one's own culture can be more of an expert with respect to an art form. So that's certainly true. There's a question of deferring to an expert about what the work's aesthetic properties are, and deferring to an expert about the merit, the aesthetic merit of the work, whether it is a great work, bad work, somewhere in the middle. So I think those things are very different. So when I encounter an expert with respect to an art form, there's a lot of things that they can tell me about both the material properties of the work and the aesthetic properties that I would not be able to discern for myself. So I mentioned, for example, stroke order, right?
Yeah.
Being able to discern stroke order, that is something you can learn from an expert, but if you're an outsider, it's probably not something you would even attend to, right? And even if you did, you wouldn't know how to see it, right?
Yes.
Music has wonderful examples of this. You really have to learn how to listen to music, and then there come to be qualities of music that you can actually hear, you couldn't individually discern. I have a very clear memory. This is going to sound like a really dumb example because I'm not a serious person about music, but when I first got to, I had a friend who was a serious musician. I was a teenager, and we were just listening to pop music, and he described me the individual instruments and what they were doing. And for the first time, I was able to resolve and hear each instrument, the guitar, the drums, the bass, the piano, distinctly. And I had never heard that before. So you need expert help in order to discern aesthetic qualities. I think that's absolutely true. But the expert might then say, okay, I hear these aesthetic qualities, and this tells me that this piece of music is excellent. And I might still say, well, I hear those qualities, but I don't agree on the excellence. So qualities of merit and aesthetic properties, I think, are two different things. Now, the paper is about deference on the question of merit, not on the question of aesthetic properties. And my view is, and I think this is probably what your question is really about, is that aesthetically, there's no reason to culturally defer.
Yes.
Right. Morally, I think there is, because if you're an expert, as you are in music, and you tell me, that you think this work is fantastic and here's why, and I laugh in your face and I say, well, I don't care about that, here's what I think, then I treated you disrespectfully. That's not an appropriate way to behave. I think if there are obligations to engage in deference, they have to do with acknowledging the existence of aesthetic properties that you might be aware of that I might not fully appreciate. But I don't have to adopt your aesthetic judgment. And I don't think there are any aesthetic reasons for me to do that.
I see.
You think there are?
I think I'm not sure what I think, but I think there is a way to argue about that. I've never thought about that question. But
This
just
is-
based on our music case, I guess I do think there is a certain reason to differ, in addition to moral.
So it does have to do with this question of whether aesthetic properties fully determine aesthetic merit. That is,
Yes.
once you agree on what the aesthetic properties are,
Mhm.
then you have to converge on aesthetic judgment.
Oh, yes.
And it seems to me that there are famous cases of people who are experts,
Mhm.
who agree on what aesthetic properties a work has and still disagree on its quality, on how great an accomplishment it is.
Okay, so when
Yeah.
they are disagreeing about their own personal preference? I could say I judge this to be aesthetically valuable, but I dislike it.
I see what you're saying. There's that famous distinction. No, I take it to be disagreements about not just personal liking,
I see.
but about aesthetic value.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
that-
I see where
that-
I'm
That
disagreeing.
disagreements about aesthetic value can arise even when there is an agreement
Okay,
on aesthetic properties.
okay.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. No more questions? Yeah. Maybe. Thank you. I found this paper very stimulating, especially the way you raise cultural difference as the support by the culture, by moral reasons, and at the same time, it challenged by the aesthetic reasons. But my main question is whether some of the objections you mentioned in your paper and in your report might be further refined by distinguishing between levels of aesthetic judgment.
Different levels.
Yeah, and firstly, I think the universalism and cultural difference may not always operate at the same level. Yeah, universalism may consider general perceptual or affective structures that make aesthetic response possible, while cultural context may concern more about the historic specific ways in which those structures are affected and organized and interpreted. So if we treat these two approaches in this view, then might not be so opposite. And similarly, moral and aesthetic considerations may not always have to be resolved by a single act. of balancing. In Chinese aesthetic and the philosophies, Confucian and Taoism orientations, these two orientations, two approaches often coexist in tension. Like Confucian aesthetic emphasizes order, the moral formations, and the public life, while Taoism aesthetic emphasizes the spontaneity and our natural needs and the resistance to overly qualified norms. And by the same time, those orientations were often recombined rather than simply break it. They coexisted through this long history. And the Chinese person have a funny saying: when you're very successful and you may believe in the competition. You devote yourself to the society, devote yourself to the public. And when you feel you're unsuccessful, maybe you feel yourself treat yourself as a loser, and then you may turn to the Taoism, and even more desperate, you turn to the Buddhism. Right. So it's kind of flexible. And this is especially clear in the interactive painting. Actually, we do have another way to create to painting, like the artist working for the palace. Yeah, they are just kind of like a really different way to choose the norms and to paste the brushstrokes and to treat the person in this painting like. But the correct painting often appears anti-normative because it resists the fixed rules and it refuses to use the standards like the palace artists will use, and that exists, in my opinion, this kind of anti-normative tendency itself could become a higher order norm. Yeah, because when I don't want to obey the rules, and then you maybe open another possibility to another kind of norm, I think. So sometimes the second order norms is not the primary norms when you enter norms. So and this may also help you find the public and the private distinction. From my point of view, aesthetic judgment is not simply private or public. It moves from the private response and to the public articulation, and eventually to the institutional judgment. So as well, the moral and the cultural responsibility becomes stronger when the judgment moves through these levels. And even I think the private judgments were already shaped by public norms, because when you use your language, like the Chinese and English, and then the certain language you use is already chosen a certain aspect to understand, and as well the cultural background do the same things. So I think when I have a thought or have a judgment about something just like this brag, it's already when I talk it, when I express it to you, and then it's not so private. It's become a common base. Yeah. So altogether, I think all these difficulties mentioned seems to suggest that we need a richer and more fine guidance account for asset judgment. Such account would be not treat judgment simply as the application of norms to properties, but would attend to its different layers. This is part I hope to explore further in tomorrow, because my own working process discussion is talking about that. And one more small terminology note in the context of Chinese painting, in your paper, page 4, canvas may not be the most accurate word, because our traditional works are usually painted on paper
Ah,
and silk.
thank you.
Than the canvas. So.
Yeah.
So maybe you can use the painting surface or the paper with it.
Very good, thank you. Okay, again, there was a lot there. But first, thank you for the correction. On your point about aesthetic judgments not being a mere application of norms, I like that. I think that's right. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a little suspicious about cultural deference, because cultural deference suggests that there is a uniform set of norms that are appropriately applied to a particular genre or art form, and that there are a set of principles that could somehow be articulated, and you better apply those if you're to appreciate the work in the right way. But as you also pointed out, in every tradition, without exception, there are always odd cases. There are always individual artists and individual works that defy those standard norms, sometimes intentionally, sometimes because they are trained in slightly non-standard ways, sometimes because they're outsider artists with respect to their own tradition, but sometimes they're trying to make a political point, right, by doing things differently. And deference to standard cultural norms for judging an artwork will mean that we, as outsiders, then miss these interesting, idiosyncratic, interesting pieces. So that, to me, is a kind of another reason, not always to engage in cultural deference. Though I do still think there are some cases where it is appropriate. You also mentioned the relationship between Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism as a way of, I think you were offering as an alternative to the public-private and to contextualism. But I would understand what you're describing as the kind of contextualism that I want to embrace, right? That is an ability to be sensitive to the situation and to say, here's a situation where I can have a better experience and treat the people around me with respect by deferring, by sitting back, listening, thinking, absorbing the wisdom of others, right? And then giving their judgment a great deal of credence, informing my own. And then there are going to be other cases where I should feel free to disagree and to be idiosyncratic. And it's not always easy to figure out how to navigate that. And I think the example of the three traditions, right, and the way in which they've been harmoniously embraced by neo-Taoists and others, right, of trying to, I think that's a good example of the kind of contextualism I'd like to go for. The last thing is your first comment reminded me a little bit of when you first started some ideas from Benze Mane's work. And I just wanted to mention that he has according to him, there's an even deeper problem than the one I talk about here. He thinks, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that in some cases it's literally impossible for an outsider to even understand an artwork. Because if you haven't been conditioned in the right way perceptually from a young age, you won't be able to make the right sorts of discriminations. This is one reason I think that I really struggle with pronunciation in Chinese. I'm not just bad at it, but I started learning when I was 30 years old. And I don't have the same ability to discriminate between different sounds, different tones. My son, on the other hand, has no difficulty with pronunciation, although other things he struggles with, but because he started to learn at a very young age. So this is a problem with even at the level of aesthetic properties, right? How can you get the aesthetic properties? I just want to say I'm not entirely convinced by Mane's arguments. I mean, I think he has some cases that I think are very clear, but I don't know how generally applicable it is and whether it's especially applicable in every art form that we really can't learn. I think there are certain cases of visual discrimination and auditory discrimination where it really is hard to develop those capacities once you're old, but not all art appreciation depends on those things. Oh, I'm sorry.
So,
Wait.
when we
My response was too long.
oh my goodness, we
We did start just a couple of minutes late, by the way. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm happy that I think all of these last comments have overlapped a lot of mine, and maybe this can clarify something. But I think that there was another resolution that comes from the recommendation to learn about those aesthetic standards or material, like aesthetic material properties of the culture. Because this seems to me to deliver well the benefits of justice or humility as well as the benefits of autonomy. Well, to put it differently, I think that there are consequential differences between two kinds of deference and two kinds of autonomy. Where on deference, you have a disengagement, which is, well, I'm not black, and so I shouldn't be able to have a list of black. Bringing engagement, which is that I should learn more about, like, taking initiative to learn more about standards that my culture is using, which is like to build community in a way that the other one won't. Likewise, I feel that there are consequential differences between two kinds of autonomy. One that's more objectivist, it's kind of the classical music is just jacking the ground because of ABC qualities that I can discern intuitively. And one that's more subjectivist, which is to turn back and kind of what I learn about myself and my aesthetic standards, and even about my culture, by sitting back and reflecting. I know about the standards of brushstroke painting. I can learn about the material qualities from your explanation. I still feel that this one is better than this one, which is supposedly more popular. But I'm now reflecting on this not as this one is actually better, but instead as what do I learn about myself from the fact that I prefer this over that. Again, I'm very conscious of what I think this is outside from professional set philosophy. But I move this. And it feels, especially when we're talking about the consequences of aesthetic autonomy, I feel like there are ways of practicing aesthetic autonomy that are going to build community and that are going to help us navigate differences with other people and then again broaden your horizons. That's much more in the addition of like, if you visit Japan recently, and in Japan there's this whole art of appreciating Japanese swords. And there's this one part that's the Homo line, that is where the soft steel meets the hard steel. And there's a whole artistic material practice that goes into how that's added. But I do feel like there's like what's coming through a lot of these comments too is about the difference between imperative development and culture.
I thought that was an excellent question, but since we're over time, I'll give a very brief response. I do think that there's another question here, which is a really important one, which is how much of an objectivist are we about aesthetic judgment in the first place? So part of the tension here is if you are kind of hard objectivist about aesthetic judgment, then when I refuse to culturally defer, then I'm saying not only am I entitled to make this judgment that's different than the consensus judgment of the insiders, but also that mine is objectively correct. And that seems problematic. So just to put my cards on the table, I'm not an objectivist, not a hard objectivist anyway, about when it comes to aesthetic judgment. But I do think the issue you raise here is important one. Thank you.
So if you are really committed to objectivism, You're not really getting all those benefits at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Let's see the 5 to 10 minutes break. Depends on how fast we can.